in the heart of a dusty African village called Mbatu, where the red earth met the horizon in a haze of heat and hunger, there lived an old woman named Naima, once known as the pride of her family, but now reduced to whispers and pity. Her wrinkled hands, once strong enough to till fields and feed her son Kito, now trembled as she searched the ground for fallen grains near the market stalls. Time had turned her home into a shadow of the past. The clay walls cracked and the thatched roof sagged like her spirit. Years ago, she had raised Kito alone. After her husband died in a mining accident, she worked from sunrise till the stars rose, skipping her meals so her son could eat. The villagers admired her sacrifice, saying, "Nima's boy will rise like the sun," and indeed, Kito did. He moved to the city, became wealthy, bought a car, and wore shoes that shined like polished gold. But wealth can blind the heart, and in Kito's case, it buried his memories beneath pride. When Nima's crops failed and her health faltered, she went to the city to seek her son, believing he would welcome her with the warmth of their old days. But when she arrived, covered in dust and humility, the guards at Kito's mansion laughed, saying, "The mad beggar claims to be his mother." Kito came out, dressed in white linen, his face hardened by luxury, and for a moment, his eyes softened. "You shouldn't be here," he said coldly. "People will think I'm from the dirt you crawled out of." Nima's heart shattered, but she forced a smile, whispering, "I came because I missed you, my son." He turned away. That night, she slept behind the walls of his house, listening to the laughter inside as her stomach growled. When dawn came, hunger led her to the back of the mansion, where she found half-eaten food thrown into a dustbin. Trembling, she reached in, whispering, "Forgive me, ancestors, for I eat what my child discards." A servant saw her and shouted, "Old witch, get away from the trash." Kito looked out from his balcony, his mother's frail frame bending over his waist. And for the first time, shame burned his soul, but not enough to bring him down. That was the moment the ancestors turned their eyes upon him, setting in motion the curse that would change his life forever. The next morning, the sun rose like an ember in the dusty African sky, painting the horizon gold as the spirits of the ancestors stirred in their eternal rest, whispering to one another about the arrogance of the son who had forgotten his mother. In his lavish city mansion, Kito sat before a table overflowing with fresh fruits, steaming bread, roasted meat, but his appetite had died somewhere between guilt and denial. The memory of his mother's frail figure bending over his dustbin gnawed at him like a restless ghost. Yet he buried it beneath pride. He told himself he had done no wrong. After all, he had given her life once, hadn't he? But the ancestors do not forget, and neither does a mother's tear shed in silence. That night, Kito dreamed of the old baobab tree where his mother used to pray. But in the dream, the tree's roots bled red dust, and its leaves whispered in a voice that wasn't the wind, "You have forsaken the womb that bore you." Kito, he awoke, drenched in sweat, his sheets tangled like vines around his body, and for the first time, fear began to take root in his chest. Days passed, and strange misfortunes crept into his perfect life. His harvests spoiled before reaching the market. The engines of his expensive cars refused to start, and his workers whispered that his house was cursed. Mirrors began to shimmer with fleeting reflections, his mother's sorrowful eyes appearing for a breath before vanishing. When he walked through his mansion, he felt cold air brush his neck, though every window was closed. Still, his pride was greater than his fear, and he laughed it off, saying to his friends, "Old superstitions can't touch a man of the modern world." But at night, when the world grew quiet, he would hear footsteps echoing softly in the halls, followed by the faint clinking of a wooden spoon, the sound his mother once made while stirring porridge for him as a child. Meanwhile, far from the city, Naima wandered the streets barefoot, her dignity worn thin but her faith still strong. Each evening she prayed beside the bins, whispering to the sky, "Let my son remember not my face, but my love." Her words drifted upward like incense to the realm of the ancestors, who gathered beneath the ancient baobab to pass their judgment. "The boy's heart has grown cold," one spirit murmured, "but it can be melted by hunger." And so the curse began. The next week, Quito's fortunes crumbled like dry earth. His business partners betrayed him, his accounts froze, and his house was claimed by debtors. The servants who once bowed now spat at his feet. He ran through the streets in torn clothes, his name reduced to dust. Hunger gnawed at his belly, and shame burned his throat. One night, he found himself before a heap of garbage behind a restaurant, the same kind of place where his mother had eaten not long ago. The smell made him gag, but hunger silenced pride. He fell to his knees, tears mixing with dirt, and whispered, "Forgive me, Mama, for I see now what you endured." As his trembling hands reached toward the food others had discarded, the wind rose suddenly, swirling the dust around him like a storm of spirits. In that wind, he heard his mother's voice again, gentle yet firm. "It is not your hunger that punishes you, my son, it is your heart." That night, Quito ate from the dustbin, not out of necessity, but as a penance. Far away, Naima stirred in her sleep, feeling the invisible bond of forgiveness stretch across the miles. The ancestors, watching from the stars, murmured their approval, for balance had begun to return to the world. The morning after Quito ate from the dustbin, the city awoke as usual, but for him the world had shifted forever. The sun that once rose like gold now burned with judgment, and every breeze carried the whisper of his shame. He had spent the night crouched behind the restaurant, his pride broken and his stomach full of humiliation. Yet for the first time in years, his heart felt light, as if he had shed a burden heavier than his hunger. When dawn painted the sky in pale hues of pink and orange, Quito stood up slowly, his once white clothes stained with dust and tears, and he began to walk away from the city, away from the ghosts of wealth and arrogance, toward the red horizon where his mother's village waited like an open wound in his soul. The journey was long and cruel. The road was hot beneath his bare feet, the wind dry as bone, and the people he passed turned their faces away, recognizing him as the man who had once looked down on them from his shiny car. For days he survived on water from streams and fruits from roadside trees, each step carrying him closer to the home he had abandoned. The ancestors watched in silence, their spirits drifting above him in the form of birds and clouds, testing his resolve. On the seventh day, as dusk fell and shadows lengthened, he reached the edge of the village looked smaller than he remembered, older, sadder, like the reflection of a memory long buried. His mother's hut stood where it always had, though the walls leaned and the roof sagged under the weight of time. Smoke curled weakly from the dying fire outside, and sitting beside it was Nima, her body frail but her eyes alive with a quiet light. When she saw him, she froze, her old heart unsure whether to believe the figure before her was flesh or spirit. Keto fell to his knees before her, his voice trembling. "Mama, I have come home." For a long time, she said nothing. The silence between them was heavier than the years that had kept them apart. Finally, she rose with effort, her hands trembling, and touched his face as if to confirm he was real. "Why have you come now, when my days are almost over?" she whispered, her eyes glistening. Keto bowed his head, unable to meet her gaze. "Because I forgot who I was, Mama. I forgot you." Tears rolled down Naima's cheeks, but they were not tears of anger. They were the release of years of buried pain. "You forgot," she said softly, "but the ancestors did not." She turned to the dying fire and tossed in a handful of herbs, their smoke rising like white threads to the heavens. "You must cleanse your spirit," she said, "for forgiveness is not given, it is earned." That night, under the same sky that had watched his birth, Keto washed himself in the river, the cold water biting his skin but purifying his soul. He returned to his mother's hut and sat beside her fire, sharing a bowl of porridge, simple, humble, sacred. For the first time in years, he tasted peace. Yet, as the flames flickered, Nima's voice grew faint, her strength waning. "The ancestors are calling," she murmured, "but they wanted you to return before I go." Keto gripped her hand, his tears falling on her wrinkled skin. "Don't leave me, Mama," he pleaded, but she smiled, her eyes already looking beyond. "I never left you, my son. You left yourself." As the night deepened, Nima's breathing slowed, her spirit slipping gently from the world of the living. When dawn came, Keto sat alone by the ashes of the fire, holding her still hand, knowing that though he had lost her, he had found himself again. The wind carried her final blessing to him, a whisper of forgiveness that would echo in his heart forever. After Nima's passing, the village fell silent, as if the earth itself mourned her gentle soul. The women wailed softly through the night, and the men gathered around the dying fire, singing low songs of farewell, while Keto sat beside his mother's body, numb and hollow, the crackling of the flames echoing in his chest like the sound of breaking bones. The elders came at dawn to prepare her for the journey beyond, wrapping her in white cloth and anointing her with sacred oils made from shea and herbs, whispering blessings over her still face. Keto watched with trembling hands, his eyes swollen from weeping, his heart heavy with regret. He wanted to scream, to beg the ancestors to bring her back, but deep inside, he knew that her spirit had already crossed the river that separates the living from the dead. When they carried her body to the riverbank, where generations of their blood had returned to the soil, the entire village followed in solemn silence. The river flowed wide and calm, its surface gleaming under the sun like liquid gold. And as they laid Naima upon a wooden raft, adorned with flowers and candles, the wind rose gently, carrying her scent and the faint rhythm of ancestral drums. Keto knelt by the water's edge, his reflection merging with hers as tears rippled across the surface. "I was blind, Mama," he whispered, "blind to your love, blind to my roots." An elder placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "The river does not judge, child. It carries both the pure and the stained to the same ocean. The raft began to drift away, and Quito watched until it vanished into the horizon, where the water met the sky. As the last candle flickered out, a strange calm settled in his soulless sense that though her body was gone, her spirit flowed within him. The villagers dispersed, leaving him alone beside the river. For hours he sat in silence, the murmur of water speaking the language of forgiveness. Then, as dusk descended, he heard a voice in the wind, his mother's, soft and distant. "The river flows, my son, and so must you." Taking those words as his sign, Quito rose, washed his hands in the water, and vowed to honor her memory by mending what pride had broken. He returned to the village, humbled and quiet. "Let me serve," he said. "Let me rebuild what I helped destroy." They tested his sincerity, giving him the lowest of tasks, cleaning the wells, repairing fences, fetching firewood. Quito accepted each with gratitude, never once complaining. The villagers watched in awe as the man who once lived in luxury now worked with bare hands and bowed head. Children followed him, laughing, while old women murmured prayers for his redemption. Over time, his strength returned, not in wealth or power, but in purpose. He built a new well in his mother's name and planted trees along the riverbank, so that her memory would breathe through their leaves. Every evening, he would sit by the water, telling stories to the children about Naima's kindness, her strength, and the curse that had become his salvation. The river listened, carrying his words into eternity, and the ancestors smiled, for balance had been restored. Yet deep within him, Quito knew his journey was not done. Forgiveness had healed his heart, but the world beyond Mbatu still whispered his name in mockery. To truly redeem himself, he would have to face the city he had left behind, the city that had seen him fall. And so, one night, under the watchful gaze of the stars, he packed a small bag, tied his mother's necklace around his wrist, and set out once more, following the path of the river toward the world that once broke him, but this time with the strength of a man reborn. The road back to the city stretched long and unforgiving beneath the blazing African sun, and though Quito's feet were sore and his body worn, his heart carried a quiet strength that no riches could ever give. The wind that once taunted him with whispers of shame now carried songs of resilience, and every mile he walked felt like another layer of sin stripped from his soul. When at last the city's skyline appeared through the shimmer of Hitha tall towers gleaming like knives against the sky, Quito paused and felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. This was the place where he had become a stranger to himself, where pride had eaten his compassion, and where his mother had been forced to search his trash for food. But he no longer feared it. He had come not to reclaim what he lost, but to face what he had been. As he entered the city, the people barely noticed the thin man in tattered clothes walking through the busy streets. Some recognized him but turned away, unwilling to see the fallen rich man they had once envied. Quito stopped before the gates of his old mansion, now a shell of ruin. Weeds crept over the cracked driveway, and the grand iron gates hung crooked, as though even they had grown tired of arrogance. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls where laughter and music once lived. Dust coated the marble floors, and the chandeliers hung like skeletons of the past. Quito knelt where his mother had once stood, beside the back door, near the trash bins and placed his hands on the cold ground. "This is where I lost everything," he whispered, "because I forgot what love meant." Tears fell silently as memories flooded his mind, the laughter of his youth, his mother's gentle voice, the smell of her cooking. He stayed there for hours until a voice startled him. "You shouldn't be here," said a young woman standing at the gate, a worker from the nearby market. "This place belongs to the bank now." Quito turned toward her and smiled faintly. "Once I thought it belonged to me," he said, "but it never did. Nothing truly belongs to us except our deeds." The woman looked at him curiously and then offered him some bread from her basket. He accepted it with gratitude, eating slowly, savoring every bite as if it were holy. Word spread quickly that the once wealthy Quito had returned, not as a lord, but as a man reborn. People gathered around him, expecting arrogance, but instead they found humility. He began helping the poor in the city's slums, using what little he had left to build shelters and dig wells for those in need. He told them stories of his mother, of how her forgiveness saved him, and how pride had nearly destroyed him. Slowly, the people who once scorned him began to respect him again, not for his name or his wealth, but for his heart. The elders of the city invited him to speak at their gatherings, and he would say, "A man who forgets where he comes from is like a tree without roots. It may look tall, but it will fall with the first storm." The crowd would nod, their eyes glistening, for they saw the truth in his pain. Yet, even as he found purpose, Quito never forgot his mother's words. "Forgiveness is not given, it is earned." Every day, he worked from dawn till dusk, building, teaching, and feeding, until the city began to change around him. The same place that had once corrupted him now became his field of redemption. At night, he would stand by the riverbank that cut through the city, the same river that had carried his mother's spirit, and whisper, "I am still learning, Mama, still trying." The water glimmered under the moonlight, carrying his words onward, and though the city lights reflected in his eyes, his soul remained rooted in the red soil of embodiment. The world had taken everything from him, but in losing it all, he had found something far greater: peace, humility, and the unbroken thread of love that even death could not sever. Months passed like the slow turning of seasons, and though Quito had rebuilt his reputation in the city as a man of humility and compassion, his heart still belonged to Mbatu, where his mother's spirit whispered through the rustling trees and the flowing river. One day, while sitting beside the riverbank in the city, he saw a little boy scavenging through a pile of trash, his small hands trembling as he picked out scraps of food. The sight pierced through Quito like a knife, for it mirrored the very pain his mother had endured. Without hesitation, he walked to the boy, knelt down, and offered him his meal. "Eat," he said softly, his voice filled with the tenderness of a man who had known both hunger and redemption. The boy hesitated at first, then ate greedily, tears mixing with gratitude. When he was done, Quito asked him where he came from, and the boy replied, "From a village called Mbatu." The name struck Quito's heart like thunder. "Do you have family there?" he asked. The boy nodded faintly. "Only my grandmother. She is sick and cannot walk." Quito stood in stunned silence, realizing that the cycle of pain he thought had ended still lived on. That night, as the moon climbed high over the sleeping city, he prayed beside the river, asking the ancestors for guidance. Their answer came with the wind that swept through the reeds. Return home, for your mother's spirit still waits at dawn. He packed a small bundle and set out once again toward Mbatu. This time not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as one bringing hope. When he arrived, the village children ran to him, calling out his name joyfully. For his story had become legend, the tale of the proud man who learned humility from his mother's love. The elders welcomed him with open arms, their eyes warm with pride. "You have brought honor back to your bloodline," one said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Kito smiled humbly and said, "It was my mother who taught me honor. I only learned to listen." He then began rebuilding his mother's hut, turning it into a place of learning for children who could not afford school. He called it the House of Naima, where he taught them stories, wisdom, and kindness. Under the shade of the baobab tree, he shared lessons about compassion and humility, telling them that true wealth was measured not by gold, but by goodness. The villagers, inspired by his transformation, began to change as well. They built wells, planted crops together, and cared for one another as family once more. The air in Mbatu seemed lighter, filled with laughter instead of struggle. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Keto stood by the riverbank where his mother had been laid to rest and felt the air shimmer with unseen presence. The river rippled though there was no wind, and from its surface rose a faint glow. Out of that light came a figure soft, radiant, and familiar. It was Nima, her spirit clothed in golden mist, her smile gentle as ever. "My son," she said, her voice like music carried on the water, "the river is proud. You have washed away your shame." Kito fell to his knees, tears flooding his eyes. "I could never repay you, Mama," he whispered. "You already have," she replied, "by teaching others what I taught you." As her spirit faded into the starlit water, Kito felt peace like never before. The ancestors had lifted their curse, the cycle of suffering was broken, and the village had been reborn through his redemption. From that night on, whenever the wind rustled the trees or the river sang its soft lullaby, the people of Mbatu said it was Nima's spirit blessing her son and through him the land she loved. Years flowed like the river that once carried Nima's spirit, and Mbatu, once a forgotten village of dust and sorrow, had blossomed into a thriving community where laughter echoed through the fields, and the scent of roasted maize filled the air. At its heart stood the House of Nima, a simple clay building surrounded by trees Kito had planted with his own hands, their branches heavy with fruit and their roots deep in the soil of remembrance. Children gathered there every morning, their voices bright as they recited lessons, sang songs, and listened to Kito's stories about the woman whose love had changed the destiny of a village. Time had etched lines into his face, but his eyes still held the fire of purpose. He no longer sought redemption. He had found it and passed it on to others. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Kito sat beneath the baobab tree where his mother once prayed. The air was warm, alive with the hum of insects and the laughter of children playing nearby. He looked around and felt a quiet pride not in what he had built, but in the hearts he had touched. A young girl approached him, clutching a small handmade doll. "Teacher," she said softly, "is it true your mother forgave you even after you forgot her?" Kito smiled gently, his gaze drifting toward the river. "Yes, little one," he replied. "A mother's love does not end when her heart stops beating. It flows like this river, carrying forgiveness to those who are ready to receive it." The girl thought for a moment, then asked, "Will my mother forgive me if I am ever bad?" Keto chuckled softly, brushing her hair aside. "If you carry kindness in your heart, forgiveness will always find you." She smiled, satisfied, and ran off to join the others. As Keto watched them, he felt the wind shift, warm and familiar, carrying the faint fragrance of his mother's cooking, the same aroma that once filled their humble hut long ago. The river shimmered under the fading light, and in its reflection he saw her face once more serene, proud, eternal. He bowed his head and whispered, "I kept my promise, Mama. Your name lives on." That night, when the stars came out, Keto lay on his mat inside the house of Naima, his breathing steady and calm. He dreamt of his childhood, of running through the fields, of his mother's laughter echoing across the hills. In the dream, she stood beside the river, her hand extended toward him, her smile radiant. "It is time to rest," she said. And when morning came, the villagers found him still lying there, peaceful, a faint smile on his lips. They mourned him with tears and songs, but their grief was light, for they knew he had gone to join his mother in the world beyond. That evening, as the sun set and the first stars appeared, something miraculous happened. The river that ran through Imbatu began to glow softly, its waters golden like melted sunlight, and the villagers gathered at its banks in awe. The elders said it was the spirits of Nima and Keto, united at last, blessing the land they had healed together. From that day forward, whenever someone in the village lost their way, they would come to the river, dip their hands into its waters, and whisper a prayer for forgiveness. The people of Mbatu lived by the lesson that flowed through generations, that pride can break, but love rebuilds, that loss can destroy, but humility can restore, and that even from a dustbin of shame, a legacy of grace can be born. And so, the story of Naima and Keto was passed down through centuries, told by the fireside to every child who would listen, a story of a mother's love so strong it conquered death, and a son's redemption so pure it turned sorrow into peace. The river still runs, whispering their names, carrying their story to the sea, where forgiveness never ends.